Imagine, it's 1942. The world is at war, and the Pacific Ocean, a vast expanse of water, is on fire. The United States, though still reeling from the devastation of Pearl Harbor, has launched a massive counteroffensive. But deep within the Pacific, there's an unseen danger, a silent threat building with every passing day. You hear the distant rumble of warships, but beneath the surface, something much more menacing is waiting. The Japanese, once thought to be weakened by the initial losses, have turned the tide. Their fleet is relentless. Their strategy is a puzzle. The United States is losing ground faster than anyone anticipated. You feel the tension in the air, as though a storm is brewing, one that could engulf not just a single nation, but the very course of the war itself. The Pacific, so vast, is now a deadly game of cat and mouse. A question lingers in the back of every commander's mind. How close is America to losing control of the Pacific? What could save them from complete collapse? And then, from the shadows, something emerges. The answer could shock the world, and change history forever. The Pacific Ocean in 1942 is a different kind of battlefield. The blue waters, stretching endlessly across the horizon, conceal the terrible scale of the conflict. It is a place where one mistake could mean annihilation, and where victory often comes at an unfathomable cost. For the United States, this vast ocean became both a sanctuary and a prison. After the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the war effort shifted drastically, and the stakes could not have been higher. But what if the war wasn't won yet? What if the tide of battle could easily have turned in the other direction? In the early days after the attack, America was reeling. The Pacific Fleet, crippled at Pearl Harbor, left the United States vulnerable. The Japanese Imperial Navy, with its unmatched strategy and ferocity, seemed poised to take control of the Pacific. A year earlier, Japan had been largely ignored by the Western powers, but after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they suddenly found themselves staring down the barrel of American military might. However, there was no denying the cold truth. The U.S. was playing catch-up. The Japanese, in their pursuit of dominance, had crafted a series of naval victories that shook the very foundations of American confidence. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942 was a prime example. It marked the first major air-sea battle in history, where both sides' aircraft carriers took the brunt of the damage. The Japanese had lost the battle, but they had successfully tested the limits of American resolve. They were no longer just an empire to be feared, they were a force to be reckoned with. And then came the Battle of Midway. On the surface, it seemed like a resounding victory for the Americans, but it was not the certainty that it appeared to be. Despite their tactical brilliance, the U.S. Navy had come dangerously close to being overwhelmed. They were still operating under the assumption that the Japanese would continue to push forward with their campaign. But what if they hadn't? What if the Japanese fleet had pressed on, pressing the advantage at Midway and beyond? The Pacific was on a knife's edge, and the United States was desperately searching for a way to regain its footing. The shadow of Japan's might loomed large, and in the moments between each battle, there was a constant sense of impending doom. A single wrong move, a single uncalculated risk, and the U.S. could have lost the Pacific forever. The moment of crisis, 2,000 words. The United States was caught in a precarious situation. The Japanese, who had spent the first year of the war consolidating their power, were now on the offensive once again. Each strike, each maneuver, seemed to push America closer to the edge of collapse. It was not just the ships or the soldiers that were vulnerable. It was the very fabric of America's war strategy. They had overestimated their own superiority, while underestimating Japan's cunning and resolve. In the midst of this, the U.S. found itself locked in a battle of attrition. For every island they reclaimed in the Pacific, Japan launched a new offensive, more brutal than the last. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was a moment where the Americans were forced to confront the terrifying possibility that Japan was not just fighting to defend its empire, it was fighting for survival. In this environment, every American victory seemed tenuous. The battles were too close. The losses were too great. But it was in the air that America's real vulnerability lay. As the war stretched on, American pilots found themselves pushed to their limits. In battles like the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Japanese Navy seemed to bounce back from each loss, adapting their tactics in real time. While American forces celebrated tactical victories, they remained deeply aware of the growing technological prowess of their enemies. If Japan could develop new strategies, new weapons, and new ways of waging war, then the US might find itself outmatched. Yet, for every moment of doubt, there were flashes of hope. The American people, bruised but not broken, rallied behind their war effort. The leadership, in Washington and on the front lines, knew that they had to do something bold, something that would turn the tide of the Pacific once and for all. They needed a new strategy, something that would neutralize Japan's technological advancements and turn their own vulnerabilities into strengths. The answer came in the form of a secret weapon, one that could shift the balance of power and bring an end to the war. But the US wasn't the only nation developing new technology. The race for atomic supremacy had begun, and in the Pacific, the possibility of nuclear warfare loomed large. The moment of crisis. Could the United States have lost the Pacific? What if the Battle of Midway had been lost? What if the US Navy had failed to turn the tide against Japan's relentless push through the Pacific? What would have happened if the Japanese had maintained their grip on the Pacific? Would America have ever recovered? The stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined, and as the year 1942 unfolded, the United States found itself at the brink of disaster. The air was thick with tension. Across the Pacific, naval commanders and soldiers alike were caught in a deadly game of anticipation. On one side, the Japanese forces, rapidly expanding their empire, crushing islands, and making bold moves that threatened to overwhelm America's defenses. On the other, the United States, struggling to regain control of the Pacific after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. It was clear that the war had not been won. Far from it. The Japanese fleet, skilled and battle-hardened, continued to press forward with a dangerous audacity that tested every American assumption about their superiority. In Washington, the decision-makers watched with mounting concern. The Japanese were on the offensive, and every report from the Pacific came with the growing realization that the US Navy, though formidable, was not invincible. The Battle of the Coral Sea, just weeks before, was a grim reminder of the high cost of war. It was the first naval battle in history where opposing ships never saw each other. The outcome was determined entirely by airstrikes. The Americans had lost ships and aircraft, but the Japanese had been forced to turn back. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. But the question lingered, could this small victory hold against Japan's powerful advance? Could America stop the Japanese momentum? Or had they already underestimated the enemy? The Pacific was becoming a battlefield unlike any the world had seen. Its vast waters, once an ocean of untapped opportunity, had become a deadly web of islands and naval skirmishes, each one carrying with it the potential for catastrophe. Japan's strategy was simple yet terrifying: expand, dominate, and destroy any hope the Allies had of turning the tide. From their stunning successes in the early months of the war, the Japanese Navy had perfected the art of surprise and swift strikes. But could that strategy last? How long could the Japanese hold the upper hand before the American military machine found its footing? The Japanese offensive, relentless and unforgiving. As America struggled to respond to the initial blows of the war, the Japanese continued to pursue their own aggressive agenda. Each island they captured became a stepping stone for their larger goal, a solidified and impenetrable empire across the Pacific. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, Japan's expansion seemed unstoppable. The loss of Wake Island, Guam, and the Philippines, the largest American defeat in the Pacific, had set a terrifying precedent. Yet, even as the US Navy scrambled to reorganize, the Japanese continued their sweep. The Japanese believed, with unsettling confidence, that they could control the Pacific without ever having to face the full might of the United States. They were fighting a war of attrition, gambling that America's resolve would fracture under the strain of long-distance battles. But this gamble came at a dangerous price. Japan's strategy, while aggressive and audacious, relied heavily on the element of surprise. And that's where the problem began to surface. Surprise could only carry them so far. In the midst of this, an eerie silence fell over the Pacific. The Japanese Navy, once the undisputed rulers of the seas, suddenly found itself facing an invisible opponent. The US Navy, now slowly recovering from its losses at Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway, which would come just a few weeks after the Battle of the Coral Sea, would turn out to be the crucial turning point in the war. A battle that would have devastating consequences for Japan. The Battle of Midway, A glimmer of hope. What if the Americans had failed at Midway? It was a gamble, a desperate move to reclaim control of the Pacific. The Japanese, believing they had already established dominance, had set their sights on Midway Island, a tiny speck of land in the vast Pacific. If they could capture it, the Japanese would have control over the Central Pacific and could effectively isolate Hawaii from the mainland U.S. Midway was a critical objective, and the U.S. had no choice but to stand firm. The Americans had deciphered Japan's naval codes and knew of the upcoming attack. The trap was set. The Japanese fleet, heavily relying on its superiority in numbers and tactics, moved in, expecting a quick victory. They did not anticipate that their carefully laid plans would be foiled by the Americans' knowledge and resolve. The battle began on June 4, 1942, as Japan's fleet approached Midway. In the early hours, the Japanese launched their bombers and torpedo planes in a bid to annihilate the American fleet, but what they didn't know was that the U.S. Navy had been lying in wait. The American pilots, equipped with outdated but reliable aircraft, launched a fierce counterattack. By the end of the day, Japan had lost 4 of its precious aircraft carriers, the heart of its naval power. Had Japan succeeded in taking Midway, the strategic advantage would have been irreversible. But the tables turned in a matter of hours. The Americans had not only stopped the Japanese advance, they had dealt a devastating blow to Japan's naval superiority. It was a victory, but it came at a heavy price. The cost of the battle was steep, and many American sailors and airmen were lost in the process. But the question remained, how long could the United States hold on before the Japanese would strike again? Was the victory at Midway just a temporary reprieve from an inevitable Japanese resurgence? The American recovery, a slippery slope. Though Midway was a turning point, it did not mark the end of Japan's aggression. It only momentarily slowed the tide. In the months that followed, the U.S. Navy began its slow and painstaking recovery. New ships were built, new strategies were developed, and soldiers and sailors who had once feared the overwhelming might of the Japanese Navy now faced their adversary with more experience and resolve. But there was still a shadow hanging over them. Despite the success at Midway, the Japanese remained formidable opponents. Each island battle, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, showed the brutal reality of warfare in the Pacific. The U.S. had learned the hard way that Japan's soldiers were not inclined to surrender. They fought to the death. The battles were long, grueling, and costly, with each island taken representing another hard-fought victory, but also another testament to the rising toll the war was taking. The question was no longer whether the U.S. could win the war. It was a question of whether they could hold on long enough to make a decisive difference. America's capacity for sustained warfare was being tested to its limits. The Japanese, though suffering losses, had not given up their dream of controlling the Pacific. And now, as the Allies prepared to invade the heart of Japan's empire, the next question loomed. How much longer could the U.S. continue to fight, before they were simply worn down into submission? The Japanese seemed to be everywhere, their reach extending deeper into the Pacific with every battle. But there was something the Japanese had not counted on. The atomic gamble. Could the U.S. win without the atomic bomb? What if the United States had never developed the atomic bomb? What if, in the dark corners of the Pacific, where the war was raging with brutal ferocity, a weapon capable of ending the conflict was never created? Could America have fought its way through the endless islands, bloodshed, and naval battles and finally won? Or had the war already escalated to a point where only the unthinkable could turn the tide? The clock was ticking, and the pressure was mounting. The Pacific was becoming an increasingly desperate battleground for both sides, and a decision loomed that would alter not just the course of the war, but the course of history itself. By mid-1945, the toll of the war in the Pacific was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and civilians had already been lost in a struggle that seemed endless. The Japanese, though beaten back at Midway and in other key battles, were far from surrendering. On the contrary, they had dug in their heels and prepared for an even bloodier fight. The Allied forces, under General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, were advancing, but the path forward was strewn with obstacles, each one more lethal than the last. The United States had hoped that, after Midway and the subsequent island-hopping campaign, Japan would begin to relent, but the reality was far darker. The Japanese military command had no intention of backing down. The brutal fighting in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa was a horrifying preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands might look like. The island of Okinawa, often referred to as the Typhoon of Steel, was a living hell for American troops. The Japanese soldiers there fought with such fanatical determination that the Americans suffered over 50,000 casualties before finally claiming victory. It was clear that the cost of invading Japan would be catastrophic. The invasion of Japan, the unimaginable cost. But what if the United States had gone ahead with the invasion of Japan? Could they have broken Japan's resolve through sheer force? Would the will of the Japanese people bend under the weight of a conventional invasion? Or was there another way to make the enemy relent? The Allied leaders were grappling with these questions throughout the summer of 1945. General MacArthur had already planned Operation Downfall, the code name for the invasion of Japan, which was to be launched in 2 stages. Operation Olympic, which targeted the southern island of Kyushu, and Operation Coronet, aimed at the Tokyo plain. The Japanese, with their elaborate defense strategies, were ready for an all-out fight to the death. Millions of civilians were trained to resist the invasion, and every building in Japan seemed to be fortified with defenses, making an invasion even more daunting. The initial wave of assaults would likely have met fierce resistance. Japanese forces were armed with some of the most advanced military technology of the time, and their suicide tactics, known as kamikaze attacks, would have been a devastating weapon in the air. On the ground, the well-disciplined and fanatically loyal Japanese soldiers were prepared to fight until their last breath. As American forces continued their island-hopping campaign, they quickly discovered that the cost of victory was rising with each battle. The brutality of the Pacific War made it clear that a full-scale invasion of Japan would result in an unspeakable number of casualties on both sides. The predictions of the number of American dead ranged from hundreds of thousands to possibly even millions. The U.S. military planners, in their quiet discussions, acknowledged the horrifying truth. This invasion might cost more lives than anyone was prepared to count. The question was now, could they win the war without the bomb? Was there another solution to the nightmare awaiting them? The silent weapon, the Manhattan Project. But what if the atomic bomb could provide a way out? What if this terrifying new weapon, still in the early stages of testing, could be the answer to the question that had plagued American military leaders? How could they end the war without an invasion that would result in unimaginable carnage? Deep within the secretive halls of Los Alamos, New Mexico, a team of scientists led by J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves worked feverishly on the Manhattan Project. Their goal was clear: to develop an atomic bomb before the Germans, or, as it turned out, the Japanese, could do so. The pressure was immense. The stakes were incomprehensible. The scientists, many of whom had fled the horrors of Europe and escaped the reach of Nazi forces, were acutely aware of what they were building. They were creating a weapon that could change the world in an instant, a weapon capable of destroying entire cities, entire populations, in a matter of seconds. By July 1945, after years of scientific discovery and intense pressure, the first successful test of the atomic bomb, known as the Trinity test, took place in the deserts of New Mexico. The explosion was unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed. The shockwave and the blinding light were not just physical, they were metaphysical, a profound realization that humanity now had the power to destroy itself. The bomb had worked. The question, however, was now not whether it could work, but whether it should be used. The decision was agonizing. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office just after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death in April 1945, now stood at a crossroads. He had been told that using the bomb could save hundreds of thousands of American lives and bring the war to a swift conclusion, but at what cost? The bomb's potential was terrifying, and no one, not even the scientists who had built it, could predict what the long-term consequences would be. Truman's dilemma grew even more intense as the U.S. continued to advance toward Japan. The plans for Operation Downfall were in motion, and Japan showed no signs of surrendering. The Soviets, meanwhile, were preparing to enter the war in the Pacific, which would force Japan to fight a two-front war, a move that could hasten their defeat but also complicate post-war diplomacy. The pressure to act quickly was enormous. The decision to use the atomic bomb was now a question of morality versus military pragmatism. Was it right to unleash such a devastating weapon on an already devastated population? Would the cost of lives saved outweigh the ethical consequences of using such a monstrous weapon? These questions weighed heavily on Truman as he considered the option that could bring the war to an end. The final decision. Could the atomic bomb end the war, or would Japan fight to the last? What if the atomic bomb had failed to bring Japan to its knees? What if, after the destruction of Hiroshima, the Japanese military had doubled down, refusing to surrender even in the face of the unthinkable? Could the war have dragged on, costing countless more lives, and leaving the Pacific forever scarred by an unrelenting fight? The world was now at a precipice, and the atomic bomb was humanity's most terrifying weapon. Its promise of ending the war was shrouded in uncertainty. As the bombs fell on Japan's cities and the deadly silence spread across the Pacific, the question remained. Could such massive destruction force Japan's leaders to surrender? Or had the bomb unleashed a new wave of fanaticism, one that would bind the Japanese people in even greater defiance of the Allies? As the smoke from Hiroshima began to clear, the world watched with bated breath, waiting to see whether the war would finally end, or whether the very existence of the Japanese Empire would collapse in flames. August 6, 1945, will forever be etched in history as the day the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The city, home to more than 300,000 people, vanished in an instant, its structures vaporized, its residents incinerated by an explosion unlike any the world had ever seen. The blast itself was over 12,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on cities during World War I. In an instant, 70,000 people were killed, and tens of thousands more would die in the coming days from radiation sickness and injuries. Yet, the most haunting question that lingered was, would this new kind of weapon be enough to stop Japan from continuing its fight to the death? The Japanese reaction. Denial and resolve. In Japan, the devastation was staggering, but the response from the military and the government was not immediate surrender. The leadership in Tokyo, under Emperor Hirohito, faced a dilemma. They had already fought a brutal, nearly total war for years, and their ideology and pride were inextricably linked to the idea of an invincible Japan. The Imperial Army and Navy, despite their losses, were still formidable, and their commanders were determined not to let the war end in dishonor. The idea of surrender was anathema to the very fabric of Japan's military culture. As the American bombers flew away from Hiroshima, leaving destruction in their wake, the Japanese leadership was forced to confront the unspeakable horror of the attack. But they had been facing defeat for months. The Pacific War had already been lost militarily. The Allies had advanced relentlessly, pushing Japan back from the Pacific Islands, and Japan had no real hope of victory without continuing to fight a hopeless battle. Yet, Japan's fanatical belief in a no-surrender policy ran deep, and as American bombers continued to take aim at the nation's cities, Japan's military leaders were determined to resist. The question loomed large. Could Japan's spirit be broken by a single bomb? Or would Japan's leaders turn to their last resort, the people themselves? Would they unleash their nation's last stand and send every man, woman, and child into battle? Could the atomic bomb, with all its destructive power, actually prolong the war by hardening the resolve of the Japanese? The world waited for Japan's response. The bomb was meant to force a surrender, but it had brought no immediate answer. Instead, Japan's leaders remained undecided, their inner circle divided on how to proceed. Japan's military leadership refused to acknowledge the full scope of the bomb's destruction, dismissing it as a mere tactical setback. The question, now more pressing than ever, was, how many more cities would have to be wiped off the map before Japan's leaders accepted the inevitable? The second bomb, Nagasaki and the cracking of Japan's resolve. But even as Japan hesitated, the United States had already made its next move. Just 3 days after Hiroshima, on August 9, 1945, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on the city of Nagasaki. Nagasaki, a port city, was just as important to Japan's war effort as Hiroshima had been. The bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was more powerful than the first, and its explosion wiped out large portions of the city. Over 40,000 people died instantly, and thousands more would perish in the coming days. It was another horrific blow, and yet, even as the bomb detonated, Japan's leaders still held on to the hope that they could negotiate terms or force a different outcome. What would be enough to break their resolve? Was it the bomb that would finally make Japan surrender, or was there something deeper at play? Could Japan's government, still determined to save face and preserve its honor, continue to fight when faced with such overwhelming destruction? The American decision to drop a second bomb would turn out to be just as controversial as the first. What the US didn't know was that Japan was already on the brink of surrender, but the leadership had been divided on whether to accept the terms. The Japanese military wanted to fight on. They believed that the emperor's honor could be preserved through resistance. At the same time, the emperor's own advisors were urging him to end the war before more destruction could occur. Yet, there was one critical factor still weighing on the minds of Japan's leaders: the Soviet Union. The Soviets, who had remained neutral up to that point, were about to enter the war on Japan's Eastern Front. Would the Soviets' invasion be the final straw, or would they embolden the Japanese military to fight even harder? The situation was becoming more complicated with each passing day. The emperor's decision. The endgame begins. The bombings had done their damage, but they had not yet broken Japan's resolve. The American military and government knew this could not continue. If Japan refused to surrender, a full-scale invasion would be inevitable, and that would lead to an unprecedented loss of life. The American people were exhausted, the economy strained, and the soldiers on the front lines were now battle-weary after years of constant warfare. The atomic bomb was supposed to be the answer to this horror. It was supposed to bring the end of the Pacific War and finally allow the world to heal. On August 14, 1945, Japan's leadership finally cracked. The Emperor of Japan, in a historic and unprecedented move, intervened directly to bring an end to the war. Hirohito, who had been worshipped as a divine figure, broke the long-standing tradition of military rule and made the decision to surrender. His voice, trembling with emotion, delivered Japan's acceptance of the Allied terms. The war in the Pacific was over. But what led to this moment? Was it the atomic bomb, or was it a combination of factors? The long-running losses on the battlefield, the imminent Soviet invasion, and the realization that Japan could not continue the war without annihilating its own population? The atomic bomb had certainly played a pivotal role in this turning point, but it was the combination of military pressure and political forces that ultimately forced Japan's leaders to accept the inevitable. Aftermath and reflections. Was the atomic bomb the end of the war, or the beginning of a new nightmare? What if the end of the Pacific War wasn't truly the end? What if, in bringing the war to a close, the United States had unleashed something even more dangerous than the conflict itself? The atomic bomb had wiped entire cities off the map and brought the Japanese empire to its knees. But at what cost? As the dust settled and the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki struggled to rebuild, the world was left with a haunting question. Had humanity truly won, or had it simply taken the first step into an entirely new kind of warfare? One where destruction was no longer just a matter of defeat, but an existential threat for all of mankind? The bomb had done its job. Japan had surrendered. The war in the Pacific, once a raging inferno, had been extinguished with an explosive finality. Yet, as the mushroom clouds dissipated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, something far more terrifying was taking shape: the dawn of the nuclear age. The world had crossed a threshold that could never be undone. The power to destroy entire populations with a single weapon now existed. The same technology that had ended a devastating war could also start one that would annihilate entire civilizations. This was the price of victory. America had emerged as the undisputed global power, but the question that loomed over the world was this: how would humanity live with the terrible knowledge that they now held the key to their own destruction? The global impact. A new world order. The atomic bomb's immediate impact was felt not just in Japan, but around the globe. While the destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was devastating, the aftershocks of the bomb would reverberate far beyond the Pacific. The implications were immense. The U.S., by using the bomb, had declared itself the world's most powerful nation, but this also placed enormous responsibility on its shoulders. The Soviet Union, already a rising power, watched closely, sensing an opportunity to rival America's newfound supremacy. As the Cold War soon took shape, the fear of nuclear warfare became an ever-present threat. For the first time in history, humanity had created a weapon capable of wiping out all life on Earth. In the months following the end of the war, there was a brief sense of euphoria, relief that the fighting had ceased, that loved ones could finally return home, that the unimaginable horrors of war had come to an end. But that euphoria quickly faded as the reality of the bomb's consequences set in. Both the United States and the Soviet Union entered a new arms race, each striving to develop more powerful and destructive nuclear weapons. In Washington, Leaders questioned whether the use of the atomic bomb had truly been necessary. Could the war have ended without it? Could Japan have been forced to surrender through conventional means? These questions haunted the American conscience as they grappled with the moral implications of their actions. The atomic bomb had won the war, but had it cost them their soul in the process? As the Cold War unfolded, a new form of warfare emerged, one not fought in the trenches, not with rifles or bombs, but with the fear of annihilation. The threat of mutually assured destruction, MAD, became the cornerstone of global politics. The nuclear bomb was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol of power, a force that could either secure peace or destroy the world in a single stroke. Japan's rebirth. The bitter legacy of the bomb. In Japan, the devastation of the atomic bomb was incomprehensible. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in ruins, their landscapes forever altered, their populations decimated. The survivors, known as hibakusha, suffered not only from physical injuries but also from the psychological trauma of witnessing the horrific destruction of their homes, their families, and their way of life. They became the living ghosts of a war that had ended with their cities incinerated in a flash of light. But even as Japan's survivors struggled with the physical and emotional scars of the bomb, the country began to rebuild. The United States, under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, took on the monumental task of overseeing Japan's occupation and reconstruction. MacArthur, once a fierce opponent of Japan, now found himself in the difficult position of guiding Japan through its post-war rebirth. His mission was to ensure that Japan would never again pose a threat to global peace while simultaneously helping the country recover from the devastation that had been inflicted upon it. The Japanese people, devastated by the loss of life and the destruction of their cities, had little choice but to rebuild. But what would Japan become in the aftermath of the bomb? Would the scars of war forever haunt the nation, or would the bombing serve as a catalyst for a new kind of Japan, one that embraced peace and democracy rather than militarism? In the years following the war, Japan made remarkable strides in rebuilding itself into a thriving, peaceful nation. But the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the horror of those 2 days, would never fade. The hibakusha became powerful symbols of the resilience of the human spirit, as well as a constant reminder of the horrors of war and the cost of using such catastrophic weapons. Yet, Japan's moral reckoning was far from over. For years, the country struggled with the question of whether it should seek retribution for its own wartime actions or focus on moving forward and healing. As the United States and Japan entered into a new era of partnership, the atomic bomb became a symbol of both the trauma of war and the hope for a more peaceful future. The psychological toll, living in the shadow of the bomb. For the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the effects of the atomic bomb were not confined to the physical wounds it caused. The psychological toll of living in the shadow of nuclear war was just as profound, if not more so. The fear of radiation poisoning, the uncertainty of how the future would unfold, and the guilt of surviving when so many others had perished all weighed heavily on the survivors. The psychological trauma of the atomic bomb was not limited to those directly impacted by the blasts. It also extended to the generations that followed. The children of hibakusha grew up knowing that their parents had lived through an event that had fundamentally altered the course of history. Many faced social stigma and discrimination, as the effects of radiation exposure were not fully understood at the time, and rumors spread about the contamination of survivors. On a broader scale, the threat of nuclear warfare cast a long shadow over the world. The fear of another atomic bomb, or worse, the possibility of full-scale nuclear war, became a pervasive presence in the collective consciousness. The arms race between the US and the Soviet Union escalated as each nation sought to build more powerful nuclear arsenals, and the prospect of global annihilation loomed larger with each passing year. In this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, many wondered whether humanity could survive in a world where a single misstep could trigger a nuclear apocalypse.